Who here has seen Dunkirk? What did you think of it? It felt a little different from Christopher Nolan's other films, don't you think? Stick around to the end and I'll explain why. The truth is that this was the first Nolan film I ever watched in the theater. I was pretty late to the Nolan party, but now that I've seen the majority of his films, I've come to the conclusion that Christopher Nolan could be a great filmmaker, but isn't yet. The reality is that he struggles on two related fronts: his cinematic storytelling and vocabulary, or lack thereof, and his kitsch and garish artistic decisions. For a lack of a better way of putting it, Nolan has some of the most interesting conceptual ideas, but executes them in poor taste. His first films don't struggle with these issues. In fact, his weaknesses masquerade as strengths. In his later films, he's not playing to his strengths. Christopher Nolan excels at making films that force us to think afterwards, not necessarily about the moralistic or philosophical implications of his films, but the actual story itself. His films always make me come back to the classic film school concepts of Fabula and sujet. Nolan juggles these concepts with ease and makes for some interesting plots and storytelling. Take Memento, for example. The Fabula story is about a man overcoming his short-term memory loss while trying to find the murderer of his wife. The sujet, the plot, is the non-linear manner in which Nolan presents the story. In reality, we experience a film twice. The first is when we watch the film, and the second is when we retroactively think about the film, as we piece together and figure out the concrete order of events. Nolan uses the actual structure of these stories to increase dramatic tension. A lot of his stories are actually quite basic, and would be boring if told linearly, but through plot, he raises the stakes. Using plot, he makes us sympathize with characters before revealing their dark secrets. Guy Pearce's character, we are shown, is coping with the murder of his wife. After these sympathies are established, we're forced to deal with the monstrosities of his character.
Do I lie to myself to be happy? In your case, Teddy. Yes, I will.
Our brains, in their never-ending quest to find conclusions and closure, make premature judgments despite being denied a clear chronological account, and inevitably our judgments about characters are proven wrong time and time again. Same with Inception. We're made to sympathize with Leo, a character who's experienced loss and is striving to reunite with his children. In turn, we have a moral justification for the heist he's trying to pull off. But the film proves to us that it is only after we've seen it beginning to end can we make reliable reflective judgments. One of Nolan's undeniable trademarks is this sort of mise en abîme filmmaking. Time and space is of little value to him, instead opting for maximum build-up and dramatic tension. This is most notable in Dunkirk. Memento at least had a pattern and rhythm as he jumps around in the timeline. Dunkirk, on the other hand, was very experimental, cut together purely on the sake of dramatic tension, contrasting scenes that in reality weren't even close to each other in time and space. Another Nolanism, which may be a strength or weakness depending on how you look at it, is that his characters aren't characters. They're ideological vessels whose only purpose is to perpetuate the rules of the universe we live in.
Look at you. What do you believe in, huh? What do you believe in?
And that's basically what Nolan excels at. He is superb at setting up the rules of the universe and then leaves us to piece it all together. But this is also where he begins to unravel. His non-characters are fine, and even great for his early films, but the moment he strays from his trademarks, we get this.
Love isn't something we invented. It's observable, powerful.
No, it's not.
It has to mean something.
Christopher Nolan's problem is that he's very kitsch. He has cool conceptual ideas, but they are executed in poor taste. It almost feels like Christopher Nolan is being too literal, incapable of nuance and subtext. His ideological vessels are trying to be human, but the results simply aren't there.
Evidence, some artifact of a higher dimension that we can't consciously perceive.
Take a look at the dialogue just preceding Nolan's breathtaking docking sequence.
Dr. Mann, listen to me.
This is not about my life or Cooper's life. This is about all mankind.
It's simply filler. It's devoid. Matt Damon is just talking inconsequential and incoherent bullshit. You could remove this dialogue and the story wouldn't change at all. Ironically, Stanley Kubrick's cold and distant characters in 2001 feel more human than Nolan's do.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What's the problem?
I think you know what the problem is just as well as I do.
Notice how each line of dialogue is deliberate and has as much intent as a line of action would. And once the dialogue has served its purpose, the story becomes completely visual.
Hal!
And speaking of bad artistic decisions, honestly, what is this?
Okay, get ready to match our span with the retro thrusters.
It's not possible.
No, it's necessary.
I'm sorry, but this is unacceptable. That line makes no sense and is worse than 1980s action movie cheese. And at least action movie lines of the 1980s are lovable and tongue-in-cheek.
Do you really think you have a chance against us, Mr. Cowboy?
Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker.
It's just disappointing because Nolan makes films that force you to figure it out, but beyond that, there's not much discussion to be had. Yeah, sure, maybe in The Dark Knight with order versus chaos and an analogy as to why it's impossible to defend from terrorism, but with Interstellar, once we've figured it out, once we have our closure, there's really not much going on other than the absolute awe that the film inspires about space travel and the possibilities of higher dimensions. Nolan may have been too literal, and what awe he may have inspired in 2.5 hours can also be inspired by Carl Sagan in just 10 minutes, listening to him talk about the concept of the fourth physical dimension.
The real tesseract in 4 dimensions would have all the lines of equal length and all the angles right angles.
Stanley Kubrick knew not to take it to a literal place, but Nolan did so anyways, because it's the nature of his character. You can't get more on the nose with this.
I'm gonna find a way to tell Murph, just like I found this moment.
How?
Love tars love.
And while we're on the topic of poor taste and execution, Inception feels like a long Freddie Wong video. An interesting concept, planting ideas in people's dreams within dreams, real interesting stuff that just descends into an excuse to have guns, guns, and guns upon guns.
More guns!
I find that some of his films simply don't live up to the potential of his concepts. I'm really curious to see how some other filmmakers would have approached these same topics. Part of the fuel for this problem is Nolan's visual storytelling. He struggles in establishing geography and blocking, and there's much to be desired in his visual coherency. Now, he gets away with it in Memento and Inception. The themes of memory loss can afford to get away with cinematic incoherency, and geography doesn't need to make sense with the dream logic of Inception, but The Dark Knight and Interstellar really suffer from this problem. Right, so let's look at the docking sequence of Interstellar. This is one of the best scenes of Christopher Nolan's career. We have visual coherency, interesting, truly creative geometric cinematography. There's never a single doubt as to what's going on. The stakes are high, the characters as well as the fate of humanity itself hangs in the balance. It's visually told, it's breathtaking. The next scene, however, we have no sense of geography. It's told entirely through close-ups. We have no sense of spaceship layout. Cooper is detailing his plan to slingshot around Gargantua, but other than that, we visually can't really see what's going on. We only see the ship in fragments, never as a whole. How many shuttles are there again? 1, 2, 3, apparently. And Cooper may have established this in dialogue, but the truth is that I probably wasn't listening given the fact that much of the other dialogue in the film is meaningless. I didn't even clue into the characters' spatial relationship to each other until much later in the scene. And coming back to 2001, once again, the spaceship's layout is established clear as day. There's never a doubt as to how many shuttle pods there are, and we know geographically where everyone is at all times. And I'm sure I could go back to Interstellar and figure out the inconsistencies and incoherencies on multiple viewings. I'm sure the geography makes sense, and I just should have paid more attention, but the truth is that there's no room for murkiness like that if you want to be a great filmmaker.
You told me we had enough resources for both of
This
us.
scene from Inception. Where is this fight happening? How many enemies were there again? How did we get here and what happened to that? And again, Inception kind of gets away with it because dream logic, but still, suffice to say this isn't just a one-off problem for Nolan. Save for a few exceptions, there's really no cinematic quality to a lot of his scenes. It's easy enough to frame a close-up and let the characters drive the story forward with dialogue. What I'm missing is visuals. Take this voiceover, for example.
Oh, where am I? Somebody's bedroom. Oh, must be her room. But who's she?
I know I'm singling this scene out and that this internal monologuing is an ongoing part of the film, but did we really need to hear him say that? Couldn't we have deduced that just from the visuals?
Did you sleep okay?
So why is Dunkirk different? It's almost as if Nolan is aware of his shortcomings as I've presented them in this video. First of all, his characters are cold and distant and thus easily relatable and more human. The film is mostly visual. There's very little dialogue.
He's on me.
In fact, one of the main characters doesn't even speak English. The dogfighting scenes in particular consistently achieve the same level of coherency as the docking scene from Interstellar. And Nolan manages to convey complex emotions using nothing but Tom Hardy's eyes. So, is Dunkirk Nolan's breakthrough film? I suspect not. I feel like there's still some to be desired, but only time will tell. But at the very least, Nolan has showcased that he is capable of visual storytelling, even if only in short bursts at this point, and Dunkirk is a step in the right direction to overcoming his obstacles.